this computer. The other night at Piedmont Road, I was doing that, and I reached down there to do it, and lo and behold, it started B part. So try to get it all on one. But we got down to verse 18, and again, we find that he's in reference to the vision that has taken place. If you go all the way back to chapter 6, that he gives us there, and he points out to us the things that will be taking place. And he started there in chapter 7, that here it is the three oracles that we just mentioned in verse 1, verse 5, and verse 10. And when we got down to verse 18, he tells us there, he says, and they shall also, go back to verse 17, all hands shall be feeble and all knees shall be weak as water. So this indicates the extreme fear that's going to come upon the people because of what's going to take place among them. But he says in verse 18, they shall also gird themselves up with sackcloth. Now we understand sackcloth is what? Time of mourning. And so the people would be so ashamed there. And horror shall cover them, and shame shall be upon all faces, and baldness upon all their heads. And so they're going to be shamed and humiliated by their sins that brought them this overwhelming destruction that's going to take place. And so they would go in a state of mourning and also demonstrate the shame of it because of their facial expressions, and also they would shave their heads. And that shaving their heads is not just something here, it's also found in other places, and you can look that up by looking up the word shave. But that was something that they did in reference to this. But he goes on in verse 19, he says, and they shall cast their silver in the streets, and their gold shall be removed, and their silver and their gold shall not be able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Lord. Notice the wrath of the Lord. They shall not satisfy their souls, neither fill their bowels, because it is a stumbling block of their iniquity. Now the point being, he points out to them there that their money would no longer have any power. I don't know. I wish sometimes I'd talk to my mother more, because she was during the days of the back when we had the Depression. And I remember her saying one time that money, you could have money, but it wouldn't buy anything. I don't know exactly. I can't remember what that meant. So some of y'all is older than I, maybe, you know. But I couldn't understand what that meant. You know, there was products, and a lot of times they just traded food. I mean, you know, if you grew something up, you trade it for something else, and just money didn't buy anything. But with them, their money could no longer have power. Money could not avert God's wrath, in other words.
Mama was a little girl during that time, and they had stamps that they could trade.
Yeah.
So, but and they had accounts. Granddaddy had
Accounts, yeah.
At those stores.
And I think that's where the song 16 Tons came out of. Yeah. It has a company store. And but I often wondered about that you know, money has no value. But the thing is, sometimes if you stop, how much would $1 buy today? And I can remember, you know, that what $1 would buy, it used to take 33 cents to buy. At one time in my life, I've heard someone explain this.
The difference in the code.
Yes.
Coca-Cola
right.
to now. I remember.
Well,
I can remember 5 cents.
Yeah. Well, I can remember for a dime you could get an RC Cola and a moon pie. I can remember that, because we used to walk 1.5 miles to the store and get that. The reason you got an RC, because it was bigger. Coca-Cola was small. You know, big RC, big old moon pie. Big old moon pie. You know. The best way to eat a moon pie, this is not scriptural, but you know, is that you take the foil off from it, the plastic off from it, put it on a plate, paper plate, and put it in the microwave and let it bulge out the side. That's like eating a Mississippi mud pie. It's very good. Make sure it's chocolate though. But they can.
Well, you didn't do that when you were a child.
No, because we didn't have a microwave. No, we didn't have a microwave. Yep. We poured peanuts in the bottle, and sometimes you couldn't get them out. You'd get them on the bottom, get all your peanuts out. The people that you carried the bottle to, they didn't like it because the peanuts were stuck in the bottle. But even money could not help them or make them think that God would just forget about his wrath. There would be no way to satisfy their appetite for the basic needs of life. And so the reason for that is that their iniquity had become an occasion of stumbling. Even though they escaped, they would be feeble, they'd be weak, and they'd be putting sackcloth on them because of the great distress that was there upon the nation, that the nation had fallen. They would be covered with horror. Shame would be upon all of them. And so one sign of mourning evidenced by the ancient people was that, according to Isaiah and Jeremiah and Micah, was shaving the head. So basically, the lessons that we learn, like in 1 Timothy 6 and verse 10, their love of money laid at the heart of their rebellion against God. And so it became a stumbling block. And so that's the idea. There's nothing wrong in being rich. It's just that if we trust in that, or we look upon it more than we do that of God, you know. I mean, if you have too much money and you know, and you want to not be have too much money, you just give it to me, you know, and I'll take care of it for you. But there's nothing wrong with being rich. I think one of the richest men in the Bible was Abraham.
I can see how this could happen. Let's say you had farmers.
Yes.
And the city folks who were buying from the farmers, buying their food from the farmers, and things were getting really tight and desperate, and the farmers were saying, "I'm not selling you. This is for my family.
Yeah.
I'm not selling you anything." So you can see how somebody would come and say, "Well, I'll give you any amount of money for that food for my family." I said, "No way."
Right.
So I can see how that could happen.
Probably during the times of famine and stuff like that, all the times that's the way that it was, you know, that there would be a famine in certain places and there was no food there. And what food people had, they were going to get rid of it. And so the same would be true here. They're going through all that they're going to go through. They're going to be destroyed. And so that could happen. He goes in verse 20, he says, "As for the beauty of his ornament, he said it in majesty, but they made the images of their abominations and of their detestable things therein. Therefore have I said, far from thee." So these people were supposed to have been, you know, here, God's special people. And yet they had gone and made all these images of their abominations and their detestable things. It makes you stop and think about, here's my Bible, New Testament, over there in Matthew chapter 23. Remember Jesus talking to them there? Matthew 23, beginning verse 37. So I can get over there right quick. And we understand that all he said there in reference to the Pharisees and Sadducees and call them hypocrites and all that type of thing. But he points out in verses 37 and 38, he says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, that killest the prophets and stonest them that sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered," he says, "thy children together, even as the hen gathereth her chicks under her wings, and ye would not. Behold," he says, "your house is left unto you desolate." And so here it was, he was willing to do anything that he could for them if they would only repent and do what he would say. But yet their abominations and and all this that's taking place. And we made reference there that God's special people. And I think today we need to get across the Jewish people, the Israelites, whatever you want, whatever name you want, Hebrews, whatever name you want to use, they were always God's special people as long as they did what God said. And
I laughed at that as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
I would hear preachers say that we as the church are God's called out, which we are,
Yeah.
special people. So I thought I was a G.
Yeah.
When I got older.
Yeah. Well, we are in Galatians 16, called the Israel of God. But the thing of it is, I think sometimes we ought to make sure that, the name Christian, that is a special name that was given. It was a divine name, Isaiah 62 and other passages in the book of Isaiah. There was going to be a new name given when the Gentiles were brought in. They were brought in Acts 10, Acts 11, and Acts 11, verse 16. There's a new name given, that name Christian. And so we're God's special people. We're God's children. God is our Father. And so we ought to stop and think about that. And just for a moment, maybe go back and as we read the Old Testament, and we read about the Jews, Hebrews, Israelites, whatever you want to call them, and we read and we study about them, you can see how overbearing, as we long suffering that God was with his people. And how that he would always take them back. No matter how bad, how evil, how wicked they got, he'd always take them back. And yet we are a special people because Jesus died for us. We can obey the gospel, and as long as we're walking in the light, guess what? The blood is cleansing us of our sins. Right, 7 through 9. And I think that we are sometimes trying to stress to members that we are a special people. In that God's sight.
Take offense when you talk about the fact we are a peculiar people, like it says and Peter.
Yeah.
But we are a peculiar people because we're supposed to follow God's laws.
Yep, because we're not going to do what people in the world do, because we're not supposed to be of the world, and people of the world do these things, and they say, well, why you have to be so different? And when I was growing up, it's always, why you're an oddball? You're odd. You're not like everybody else. Well, we just don't do those things. My mother told me we're not supposed to be doing those things. If my mother catches me, I know what's going to happen to me to get home. So and we didn't have cell phones, and we didn't have games to play. You just had extra work to do, or then we got a whipping or a whooping, and have to go get her own hickory. And you always got a good one because you didn't want her to go get it. But he goes on, he says, I would give it into the hands of the strangers for prey, and to the wicked of the earth for a spoil, that they might pollute it. And they shall pollute it, he says. So riches that had been a source of pride for them, and not only that, but everything treasured, he says, that's going to become unclean. He says, my face will I turn also from them. To me, that is a very powerful statement. Like 1 Peter 3:12, the eyes of the Lord over the righteous, but the face of him that doeth evil, he's against those. He says, my face will I turn away from them, and they shall pollute my secret place. What was his secret place? It was a good question. For the robber shall enter into it and defile it. So what would that be? Holy of holies, yes. The most holy place. See, the most holy place, can you imagine? The only person that could go in there is the high priest. He's the only one that could enter there, and he's only could go in there on the Day of Atonement. And that would be the 10th day of the 7th month of Tishri. But yet they would desecrate it. It would be desecrated because of the presence of pagans. And so God would allow even the temple to be profane. He would allow that. And this was something that the Jewish people never thought that would happen. I think y'all talked about that in Jeremiah chapter 7. The words that he uses here are very emotional words used are a healthy reminder of when God acts in judgment, he himself suffers pain and grief. Now, not as we would stop and think about in a human way, but as well as those whom his holiness had condemned. God is long-suffering toward us, and it has to, as I use the word that I use, it has to bother him that we're not, like here, they're not faithful to him. And he's really concerned about that. And we have to remember studying this, is that the Messiah is going to come through this group of people, and yet look how bad or how evil and how wicked they had become. But the Messiah is still going to come through him. Go ahead.
We remember in John 14 that Jesus told Philip, you've seen me, you've seen the Father.
Right.
And we see Jesus looking over the city of Jerusalem and weeping over their disobedience. And so we know from what he said that that's how the Father hurts over our disobedience.
Yes. He says, make a chain, for the land is full of bloody crimes, and city is full of violence. Now, the idea is they were told to make the chain, that is a chain that would bind the captives together as they were being carried off to that of Babylon. And so criminals are bound by chain, and so that they cannot escape punishment. So therefore, he's simply saying, you're not going to escape. So to these people, they were going to be bound. They would not escape the punishment that's going to happen to them. Just the same is true. When I read this and then continue to study it, then it makes me stop and think about when he talks about their punishment and what's going to happen to them, that you stop for a moment and think about the judgment that we're going to face. All of us are going to face. If a person dies not in the right relationship or has not obeyed the gospel and have kept a right relationship with God as they've obeyed the gospel, then what awaits them? He says, wherefore I will bring the worst of the heathen, and they shall possess their houses. And I will also make the pomp of the strong to cease, and their holy places shall be defiled. So the worst of the nations, and that was Babylon. Chapter 28 and verse 7 talks some about that. The Babylonians were feared warriors, my understanding. They were known for their brutality and their cruelty. Now, it's hard for me, and maybe try to picture the Babylons, is to go back and, last few years that we saw ISIS and all what the Taliban, what they did to people, how brutal they were. And can you imagine that taking place? And here it is, back then with that of God's chosen people, because they had rebelled against God, and God brought in this nation that is Babylon, and they were brutal. They were cruel people. Habakkuk talks about in Habakkuk chapter 1 and verse 6, and Habakkuk in that verse was amazed that God would send a wicked nation to destroy his people. And so God had to explain to Habakkuk that the Chaldeans on the day of judgment was also coming, but for a time God intended to use them as his rod of judgment against the Israelites. Yes, they weren't going to escape for what they were doing. So God used them, and we understand that God is in control of everything. And so things happen. And someone says, well, why do we go through some of the things we do with maybe some of the politicians that we have? And why do we go through all this kind of stuff? Well, sometimes we get what we deserve, but we still have to remember God is in charge, and here they are. A remnant of people are going to be left, even though the Babylonians are going to slay a bunch of people. God is still in control. The pride of the strong ones refers to the magnificence of their greatness and haughtiness princes, who gloried in their wealth and their high positions. And so their holy places, and that would be the various parts of the temple, those things were being defiled, he says. And their holy places shall be defiled.
Didn't they carry away all the articles?
Oh, yes.
Well, if they were making idols, do they possibly be referring to even other places of idol worship?
Yes, they were worshiping idols. The Israelites were. And not only that, we're going to get over there in a few minutes where he talks about the 25 men and also the 70 and what was taking place among them and what was taking place even in that of the temple itself. And that's the thing with me is, is that we understand the temple is the place that God dwells. And we understand we have this building, and it's just a building, but when we come here, it's a place of worship for us. And we could imagine if somebody came in before we got here and desecrated, as we would say, they tore up everything and maybe destroyed all kinds of stuff, and how we would feel. Can you imagine how God felt that here's this beautiful temple out there that has been made for them, and God's dwelling place is there. God was dwelling there, and yet we're going to see what they did to it.
Jeremiah 3:28, for according to the number of thy cities are thy gods of Judah.
Jeremiah 3:28.
So it wasn't just Molech and Baal.
Yeah.
What they had multiple.
Well, my understanding is when we use that word Baal, that it talks about multiple Baal, B-A-A-L. Yeah, it talks about, if we use B-E-L, maybe that's just one God, but when they use that B-A-A-L, he's talking about a multiplicity of that of gods. It's about, I guess, what we would stop and think about Acts 17. They had a God for everything.
This talks about that the word destruction in 25
Yes, we're going to.
means shuddering.
Right. Destruction cometh, and notice the word cometh there. It continues to come. They shall seek peace. Jeremiah said they say peace, peace, where there be no peace. Then in Jeremiah 6:14. He says, and there shall be none. That's right, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I need to interrupt. Just as a little side note there, when we're talking about the polytheistic nature of these people at this time, it's hard for us to imagine, but I've worked with a few different people in the last several years who were from India, and they still practice a very polytheistic form of religion, I guess you'd call it over there, where, like you say, I mean, for everything there is a God. I mean, they revere all kind of animals, and it's so foreign to us, and I think in some ways almost laughable if we don't try to stop and and have some respect, because of course we would have to have some respect for them in order to reach them. But just wanted to throw that out there in case some of y'all didn't realize that. I'm not trying to be a know-it-all, but anyway.
Here's the kicker to this. These are people who had the law of God.
Yes.
And the other people are without excuse also. And it seems to me, you pointed out how many times it says the Lord said, or what, that phrase in Ezekiel. And it seems to me like every time he does that, he's reminding them Jehovah is the one who's the God. All these others are not. Yep. And it's sad that he's having to tell them, remind them who the one true God is.
Well, they had done, I look at Acts chapter 17 there, because they had gods for everything, but then they had the unknown God. And that's what I look at in my mind, is I picture them having the same thing, the idols. And then they knew who Jehovah God was, but they considered him to be just like all the others.
I always felt like they just wanted to make sure they had one more cover.
Well, yeah, what I'm talking about in Acts 17, yes. But I'm talking about here, the Israelites. That they looked upon Jehovah as just like Baal. And
That's really a commercial here.
yes, sir. Dunkin' Donut commercial.
We have a seminar coming up in a couple of weeks on how to teach Hindus.
Okay, a seminar coming up. When? Yeah, know the day. October the 20th on how to study with Hindus. That's all y'all know that out there.
Any of your former?
He's a Christian.
Yeah.
He's from India.
The thing is when I was in the school of preaching, that's back in the 70s, 73, 75, there are a lot of mission workers getting ready to take place. I mean, people were, graduating from school, then we'd have missionaries come in and talk about the work and so forth. And yet we found out that there was, in one country, people were starving to death. And somebody says, well, why are they starving to death? So every time we see pictures that missionaries come back, so I'll show all these pictures about their cows. And they said, oh, they don't kill the cow because they worship it. And people starving to death. So you can imagine what Emily was saying in reference to that, what they worship. But I have a family that rents a house from me that I have. I only have one. That's enough. If you want to buy it, I'll sell it to you. But anyway, but I went there one Christmas around December, and they told me to come over and then pick my rent up. Sometimes they bring it to me, sometimes they call me. I went over in the corner because they were Catholic. You already seen what they had set up because it was the Christmas holiday. And I asked them, I said, what do you do? And they said, that's where we worship during this time. They had all kinds of dolls and all kinds of stuff. They're from Mexico. Huh?
Shrine.
Yes, that's what it was. It's a shrine. That's what they called it. He said, yeah, they were from Mexico. They were from Mexico. Yes. Yes. And they were burning too. So the idea was here is though they would when they were afflicted, they would go out and try to seek peace, but they got torment. There's what?
They try to appease the gods.
Yeah.
And that'll help them.
There's simply no relief that was going to come to Judah. No relief. They'd just gone too far, and God wasn't not going to give them all. Now, all along, He said some of them's going to remember the remnant. Every time we talk about His wrath and what He's going to do, there's going to be a group of people, the remnant, that is going to be taken care of. Now, the full amount of God's wrath will be poured out. And in my mind, looking at those words that He uses, fury and wrath and furious and so forth, there would be no peace until His wrath was spent. And so He says, mischief shall come upon mischief, and rumor shall be upon rumor. Then shall they seek a vision of the prophet, but the law shall perish from the priest and counsel from the ancients. Now think about that. The law. That Mike just mentioned, they're under the law of Moses, and here it was. What happened to their law? Well, it wasn't being taught. You go back to Hosea 4 and verse 6, during the times of the captivity going off in Assyria. He says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge in Hosea 4 and verse 6. Well, the situation would go from bad to that of worse. When the people thought their plight could not get any worse, another disaster would come. You stop just for a moment and think about the hurricanes that we've had. You know, about Puerto Rico. Can you imagine what they went through in those two hurricanes? One came through, and they were just trying to get up to, to standards again in reference to that of their country. And all of a sudden, here comes this other one. Well, that's the way it was with the Israelite people. One after another disaster would come upon them. They would seek a sign from a prophet, but there would be no such word from the Lord. Why? Because the Lord had left them. In chapter 11, we're going to see so. Those most relied upon for guidance would be silent. The prophets, tell us something. What's going on? You remember Jehoshaphat and all of them, all the time they wanted a prophet, and sometimes they'd call for the prophet and they didn't want to hear what the prophet had to say. Well, here the prophet wouldn't say anything. The prophet would have nothing to say because he had received nothing from God. Why hasn't he received something from God? He's the spokesman for God to that of the people. Why hasn't he received something? Because they've gone too far. The priest would be silent, having to admit his utter ignorance of the law, the very tool he was commanded to use to instruct the people. The elders who were given the charge to oversee the people, to judge them righteously, to encourage them to be faithful into the covenant and their secular and religious activities would be unable to give counsel. There would be no peace. at all. The king shall mourn, and the prince, he says, shall be clothed with desolation, and the hands of the people of the land shall be troubled. I will do unto them after their way, and according to their, I was going to say deserts, but that's deserts. Will I judge them, and they shall know that I am the Lord, he says there. So they had no answers at all. The leadership had failed in its responsibility to lead the people to that of what God had instructed for them to be led. And you recall when you go back and read the book of Deuteronomy, the latter part of the book of Deuteronomy, how that God told them, if you do what I tell you to do, if you'll be faithful to me, this is what I'm going to do for you. They were not faithful. The kings, the people had sought that peace early, and it would have been available, but there was no peace now. The kings and the priests there, or princes, would be horrified, and they would mourn. God had judged Israel by her own judgment, by the Mosaic covenant. They should not have known and followed. They did not know. How many people today are even of the Word of God? You stop sometimes and we ask ourselves the question. I mean, sometimes if you get into like questions and answers with members of the church, and sometimes we see the ignorance that are there. People are not studying the way they are to be studying. And sometimes they just simply don't grow. And so the punishment that was going to be brought upon them in the siege and destruction of Jerusalem was in keeping with the evil of which the people were guilty. And so they were given what they deserved. And the same would be for us as we stop and look at this in reference to judgment. We're going to get what we deserve. In chapter 8, he says there, and it came to pass in the 6th year, the 6th month of the 5th day of the month, as I sat in my house, and the elders of Judah sat before me, that the hand of the Lord God fell there upon me. Now, in chapters 8 through chapter 11, they form a unit. They're telling us about Ezekiel's second vision. And around 14 months has passed since the opening vision of the book back in chapter 1. So in chapter 8, Ezekiel witnessed the idolatrous practices at the temple itself in Jerusalem. And now notice again, he's having these visions. He learned that what God planned to do about the abominations that the people had done within that of the temple itself. And then in chapter 9, he saw the destruction of the people and the departure of God's glory from the temple. Then in chapters 10 and 11, Ezekiel was given hope concerning the remnant to be saved. There is some hope. And so we begin with chapter 8 there. God had declared back there in chapter 7 and verse 6 that the end has come, but now the reasons for the condemnation are going to be given in chapters 8 through 11. So Ezekiel was allowed to see the extent of which the religious corruptions had overcome Israel's leaders. And he observed that the people of Jerusalem were immoral, and that he was told that those who did not have the mark of God on them were doomed. I enjoyed studying about that mark, and we'll see when we get there. There's two marks. There's one for the righteous and one for the unrighteous. So if you look at verse 1, we see that these events, as we said, the 6th month, and so it seems logical that Ezekiel would be in the middle of Judah's judgment when this vision came to him by comparing those dates that we gave. And I don't know if you put them in your Bible. I have them written in mine by the chapters and so forth. But back to chapter 1, this would account for about 14 months. And so this is around September 592 BC, according to the way people dates the dates in the book of Ezekiel. Now, Ezekiel sat with the elders of Judah. Now, the people realized that Ezekiel was a prophet, spokesman of God, chapter 2 and verse 5. And they wanted to hear a word from the Lord. So several times in the book, like chapter 14, verse 1, chapter 20 and verse 1, chapter 33 and verse 31, the elders will come and consult with Ezekiel. Now, they're the leaders. Now, we have the elders. They're the leaders, as we said, the people as a whole. But then you also have the prophet, which is Ezekiel, but you have the high priest and the priests. The elders are sitting before that of Ezekiel, and they were the leaders of the Judean exile in Babylon, who had already been deported from Judah in the captives of Daniel back 605 and Jehoiakim 597. So Ezekiel was a man of God, the type of person who would not answer unless the hand of the Lord moved him to speak. And that's what they had to do. He just couldn't speak of himself, just come out and speak. Now, don't get me wrong. I think the prophets carried on conversations, but they didn't prophesy. if God didn't give them a prophecy to prophesy.
You cited chapter 14, verse 1, the elders came to me.
Mhm.
Verse 2 and 3, which I know we'll get there eventually. The word of the Lord came to me saying, these men have set up idols in their hearts. So why do they keep going to Ezekiel? If they're already idol worshipers, what are they looking for from Ezekiel, do you think?
Well, again, they think they have those idols, and they, like I said, they put the idols, it seems to me that they have put the idols and God on the same level. Therefore, and to me, it seems as if that the idols are not giving them what they want, and therefore they're trying to get Ezekiel to approach that of Jehovah. And they have it, and they have, well, they're also now, they haven't been taught, but they do understand that the prophet is the one who receives the revelations from that of God, Jehovah, as we would say, as the Lord. And therefore they're going there and see if there's a word. You know, I guess they would go to their idols and see if there was anything also.
Again, kind of like Acts 17.
Yes.
Where they had all these different, they would just go to every one of them to see what everybody thought about what their God was saying. So,
Yeah, and I, you know, again, you get to Acts chapter 17, you talk about that and make the same reference here. You know, what were they so deceived that they would go there and they'd have thoughts in their mind and they'd leave and think that this wooden idol said something to them or moved them to do something other? You know, like we have people that way today. You know, that they'll talk about, well, the Lord spoke to me and this is what I'm supposed to do. Well, the Lord didn't speak to us that way. The Lord speaks to us through the Word of God. But this is not the Word of God that they heard. And so do they do the same way? You know, in reference to those idols, they go to them, but yet, you know, they're not getting solutions to their problems. And so they go to the prophet and see if they've heard anything. Well, he's not telling me. They don't get anything from the idols, and they're not getting anything from God, from the prophet. In other words, from God.
Well, they are literally, the idol is the first place they go
Yes.
to. They worship the idols, and they're through them as they go into the house of God and offer the worship that's required of God. But that's more of a ritual than it is of a true understanding. Their prophets are false prophets. So if they go to them for the word of the Lord, they're going to get a false message.
Right. They're going to speak of themselves. I mean, whatever they give to them, it just comes from them, not from God, the false prophet. And what they're eventually going to do is that we're going to see when he talks about what they've done to that of the temple, we're going to see they have brought those abominations. They brought the idols into that of the temple itself. So it seems to like, you know, they have a combining of the idolatry with that of Jehovah. But Jehovah has left. They have profaned, desecrated the temple. God is no longer there. He's left. We're going to see that. Now, then he says something here. He says, then I beheld, and lo, a likeness as the appearance of fire. The Hebrew word there, and somebody, y'all look in your New King James there. It says, 8:2 says, lo, a likeness as the appearance of fire, from the appearance of his loins, even downward fire, and from his loins even upward as appearance of brightness, as a color of amber. Some version translates the word fire man. Y'all have man, or does anybody have man in their, like New American Standard says man? How about this? Anybody have footnotes? I mean, sometimes out in the margin they'll put the word. Mine doesn't have that. Mine has fire.
New American Standard has a footnote that says literally fire.
Fire. Well, the Hebrew word and its meaning is fire, fire, flame, supernatural fire, company, Ethiopia. One says fire for cooking, roasting, parching, and altar fire and God's anger, figuratively speaking. So this actually, what verse 2 refers to, is actually refers to that of God.
Now, the ESV says the appearance.
Does it?
And I was mistaken, this one does not say son of man, it just says figure like that.
Figure like that of a man. Okay. See, when you look at how he describes it, that's what you come up with, is a man.
But it says in the note that the Septuagint said the Hebrew of fire. God.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Verse 3 says, and he put forth the form of a hand, see now again, and took me by a lock of my head. I gather he had curly hair. And the Spirit lifted me up between the earth and the heaven and brought me in visions of God to Jerusalem. Now, okay, so we have to get that. Now, he's having this vision of God in Jerusalem to the door of the inner gate that looketh toward the north, where was the seat of the image of jealousy, and provoked to jealousy. Now, in the notes, I think if when y'all got those or when you get them, I have it set up. Now, we're going to let this be, that over there is the temple. Y'all don't have that, but I can't do that. But you know how the temple was set up. In other words, you walk through, and here was the altar of burnt offerings. Then you go inside, there was the laver. Well, over to the right side, over to the north gate of the temple, there was this image of jealousy, whatever it was. That's where it was. And so the context lets us know that he is talking about God, and what Ezekiel refers to is visions of God. The events in the vision depicted the reality of the situation in that of Jerusalem. And so since the section was given to justify God's condemnation of the people, it has to reflect accurately the corruption that was found in Jerusalem. And so they're in the temple. So here's that northern gate, as we say, on the north side, and was one of the three which provided access to that of the outer court. There was three of them. And so you had the north side, the south side, and east. East, yes, east. I always think about north, east, west, south. News, N-E-W-S. That's what I always keep it in my mind. But so since Ezekiel referred to the visions of God, then you look at this section was given to justify God's condemnation. This northern gate was one of those three that goes to the inner court, and this was the seat of the idol of jealousy, which provokes to jealousy. Now, jealousy in the Hebrew word, quinah, Q-U-I-N-A-H, is a noun. And when the noun is used, according to the Hebrew, it relates to divine disfavor. It has nothing in common with human jealousy. It is derived from the verb meaning to acquire as one's own property, and it denotes in the first instance the vindication of one's rights. So that's what was there. Now, the phrase, the image of jealousy, which provoketh to jealousy, means the image of outrage against that of authority, which provides him to vindicate his exclusive rights. Talking about God. So the term describing God as being zealous or jealous for his violated rights is used in Ezekiel and other parts of the Old Testament, and only in respect to the sins of idolatry and immorality. You ever notice, go over there in Exodus chapter 20, verses 3 through 6, and see what he talks about having, other gods before him and things of that sort. So what is the image of jealousy? Well, there are some suggestions. Maybe the graven image of Asherah, which Manasseh put in the house of the Lord, 2 Kings 21. Then he removed it in 2 Chronicles 33. Then Josiah disposed of the idol, 2 Kings 23. So some speculate that one of Josiah's successors may have made another one and set it up in the northern gate. Then secondly, others speculate that Zedekiah reestablished the altar. Then third, others say it's possible that is a reference to what Ahaz had done in chapter 16 of 2 Kings earlier. But whatever it is, it provoked God. Whatever it is.
Is there going to be any significance? I was just reading this, and I remember that just a couple chapters ago, he had a shaved head. He had been degraded, to a shaven state. Is this an indicator that he was less degraded, or he was coming back into some sort of power or something with God? I mean, that he had hair to be pulled by. I mean, is there any significance between?
Well, I took it that the others that shaved their heads were those who were that were mourning for the conditions, wasn't it?
As for you, son of man, take a sharp sword,
Yeah,
and use it as a barber's razor on your head and beard.
well, it's been 14 months since that time. And then they would, every time they were in a state of mourning, like I said, you go back to Isaiah and Jeremiah both, they shaved their heads. So here, though, like you said, though, there's a good point that his hair has grown back. If he grabbed him by a lock, of it. Whatever this image of jealousy, it provoked that of God. It was an insult to God, to his character, and especially to his holiness. The idol mocked his law regarding worship, You go back to Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 3, the first three. My relation, or their relationship with God, the first three of the Ten Commandments. And so we find that it mocked God and his law regarding worship and the sanctity of that of the temple. We're going to see as we continue how bad the temple really is. God has declared in the Mosaic covenant that he alone was God and that all idolatry was forbidden. And this was over and over and over again. Then we come to the New Testament. Matthew 6:24 says no man can serve two masters. Now what were they trying to do? Try to serve idolatry and Jehovah. Now the idolatry, they had every idol for everything you could think of. But there was only one God, one Jehovah, one Lord. And they were trying to worship two, and you could not do that. And that's what he's trying to get across. And it seems to me, because of how far they go, I mean, because they're going to desecrate, as we said, the temple. This is the presence of God. This is where God is, and they're going to desecrate that to the very point that they had a mixture of that of their idols into that of the worship of that of Jehovah God, which is no longer worship. I think we can learn some things from that we're supposed to worship a certain way, and they were supposed to worship a certain way. And when they did not do that, then they desecrated and profaned. Yes?
It's interesting to me that some characteristics of humanity are attributed to God in this passage. In that, in verse 1, it does mention that the hand of the sovereign Lord came upon him there. And I know that could be somewhat figurative, but then it does immediately go into saying that the figure of a man that we've described,
Right.
did take him by the hair with his hand. So I guess it's either just a vision, though, or a messenger of God. Did y'all determine exactly? Or was that?
Verse 3 says he stretched out the form of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then he just it looked to him like.
Ezekiel's having to, he's seeing the vision, and he's telling what he actually sees in the vision.
Yeah. And I'm in no way trying to humanize God. Even
Well,
though
yeah, I
that
understand that.
word. But we are then again made in the image of God.
Well, like he talks about the hand of God was upon me. Well, that wasn't really a hand, but what would that mean in a figurative sense? What would it mean to a person? See, I mean, we look in the denominational world, sometimes they'll talk about stuff like that. Well, the hand of the Lord was upon me. What do you mean by that? Or sometimes they'll make the observation in reference to the Spirit coming to them. The idea is a figurative in reference to that of the presence of God. He knew the presence of God was there with him.
Yeah.
I guess some of the symbolism to these visions are lost on us.
Yes.
Because we're not of that culture.
Right. It's hard for us to go back and look. I mean, even more so, maybe we might get some view of it, but our children may not get that view unless they're taught certain things. Now, sometimes if we go back and read ancient mythology and things of that sort, and the way that it puts all that, which I've never done that, but sometimes the figurative language, I have to really try to figure it out or read what other people have said to try to understand it.
It is in some ways similar to the description in Revelation 1.
Yes.
With the bronze glowing feet and the eyes that were blazing fire, which, not to get us totally off track, but I think some people interpret that to be Jesus, and some I'm not so sure about that.
Well, again, this has the mixture of fire and metal. The New American Standard says that the upper part appeared as hot metal.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it says in verse 4 then, and behold, the glory of God, of the God of Israel. Notice that the God of Israel was there, according to the vision that I saw in the plain. Now, he explains to us what he has just seen in first three verses. Behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there. So it's remarkable in the view of the corruption in Jerusalem that the glory of God of Israel is still there. But in chapter 11, God's glory will depart. Then said he unto me, now this is God speaking to him, Son of man, lift up thine eyes now the way toward the north. So I lift up my eyes the way toward the north, and behold northward at the gate of the altar this image of jealousy in the entry. So in verses 5 through 18, God shows Ezekiel 4 abominable acts being committed by his people. The idol of jealousy in verses 5 and 6, and we're going to talk about the others too. As we get to, but the hidden idolatry of the elders, the hidden idolatry of the elders of Judah, number 2, verses 7 through 13. Number 3 was the women weeping for the god of Tammuz, verses 14 and 15, and then the sun worshippers in verses 16 through 18. So each of the abominations is described with repetitive phrases which are used for emphasis. Now we understand in reference to that about emphasizing, they try to emphasize things, just like Jesus at John 3, verses 3 through 5. Verily, verily. He could just said, verily, I say unto you, but he said, verily, verily. Why did he say verily, verily? He wanted to emphasize. Yes, and so we're going to see the same thing here, that how he tries to emphasize the things that are actually taking place. Then he said, verses 5, 8, and 12, and then he says, and he brought, verses 7, 14, and verse 16. Then he says, he brought Ezekiel to the very location where these sins were being perpetuated. Now, again, it's a vision. On verse 5.
Which chapter? I'm sorry.
48. 48. But you have to get the picture now. He's in this vision. He's actually like as if Ezekiel is right there in the temple in the city of Jerusalem. He says he says, seest thou, verses 6, 12, 15, and 17. God wanted to make sure that Ezekiel observed the totality of the situation. Notice in every aspect of the evil that had been done by his people. Now you look down through, like I said, then he said 3 times, he brought, verse 3 times. He seeth thou 4 times. Then he says, thou shalt see greater abominations. Actually says all that, verses 6, 13, and 15. So as if the sin were not bad enough, God prepared Ezekiel for something even worse. The 4th admonition serves as the climax of the whole section. God was asking Ezekiel to recognize the significance of what he was seeing. It had been more than 5 years since Ezekiel had seen the city that he loved, and even the center of the city, the temple. Been 5 years. So the degree of wickedness in Jerusalem, and more astonishingly at the temple, would have stunned even the most pessimistic prophet. So the text describes the image of jealousy at the entrance of the north gate. This gate is called the altar gate because animals were slaughtered there. Leviticus 1 and verse 11. And there is in the notes a picture of that. It don't look as to whatever you want to call it, but it's best I could do. Verse 6, he said furthermore unto me, Son of man, seest thou what they do? Even the great abominations that the house of Israel committeth here, that I shall go far off from my sanctuary? But turn thee again, and thou shalt see greater abominations. So God was asking Ezekiel, do you see why? He said, to see why he should be far off from my sanctuary? God's people were actually doing things that would force God out of his sanctuary. Now, why is that? It's a 3-letter word. S-I-N.
It's the original sin.
Yes. Well, the thing of it is, God does not tolerate sin. And so here it is. They've gone and made this building a place of evil. So as awful as this first abomination was, though, the Lord forewarns Ezekiel. He says, now, the things you're going to see next is even worse than the first thing you'd see. We would say, well, how could it be worse? God's love. It was necessary for Ezekiel and the Israelites to see the real condition of the nation as God perceives it. This is what God's telling us.
Isn't he basically giving an affirmation here to Ezekiel of what the people have already assumed, that they can do all this because God doesn't see them, he's not
That's
there
right.
with them.
Yes.
He's basically affirming, yeah, I've left them already.
Well, that's what they think. They think, well, since God is no longer in the temple, in the sanctuary, because of all the things that we've done, then God doesn't see us, but that's not true. That's again a falsehood that they were telling themselves. And it's even today that we make some of the same things to ourselves. You know, that we do something else. Well, God does see us, but maybe we think in our mind that God won't see me or God won't hold it against me. But God sees everything that we do.
Acts 5.
Yes. Right.
Yeah, it's a misnomer to say that he doesn't see you, but he will stand away.
Yeah. So.
And also you're talking about seeing but not helping.
Yes.
Right.
He saw, but he wasn't helping.
Yeah, and that's the thing that, again, what you mentioned, the hurt of God. And you stop back for a moment, and here it is. It's his people, and he's done so much for them. He has this great plan that was before the foundations of the earth. And it's got to come through these people according to what he's already said. And yet here they are. He's looking down upon them, and through that Ezekiel, he's trying to get Ezekiel to see, well, I want you to understand this is the way I perceive everything, God is telling me. And so how would God perceive us? Years ago, some people would ask the question in reference to if Jesus was returned to the earth, which we returned to the earth, and he walked upon the earth, what church would he go to? Well, he would go to the one that does what he has commanded for them to do. And so that would ought to help us to go back and search, make sure we're doing what God tells us to do. And that's what's happening here. Then he says in verse 7, he says, and he brought me to the door of the court. And when I looked, behold, a hole in the wall. Here begins this second admonition that God showed to Ezekiel. The door of the court is presumably still referring to the north entrance now. And in this area was a large chamber, and where the priest and the Levites would reside, according to chapter 40, verse 44. And when Ezekiel looks in, he finds a hole in the wall. Now, what does that show? Yeah, they're not maintaining anything, are they? What kind of upkeep? Some people say upkeep reflects the people's, and people's disregard for the temple area. Then he said unto me, Son of man, dig now in the wall. And when I digged in the wall, behold, a door. And so God tells him, you dig into the wall. And so he does that. And yet when he's, as we look at him doing that, now digging, we would understand probably that refers to that of search for truth. And he said to me when he saw the door now, he says, go in and behold the wicked abomination that they do here. So Ezekiel, he says, you go in there through that door and see what they've done. Now, who was doing this? Drop down to verse 11. It's the 70 elders. Okay? And he says, so I went in and saw, and behold, every form of creeping things and abominable beasts and all the idols of the house of Israel portrayed upon the wall round about. What did he see? He says, when I look upon the walls, all of these things that God had made, all these creeping things and abominable beasts and all these idols, all that stuff was written on the wall. Now, what did Deuteronomy 4:16 through 18 tell? There he describes 3 categories as unclean, and there you have them. The people have made all the walls of this holy place into murals to worship along with their idols. It seemed that each elder had a room where he did this according to verse 12, we see here in a minute. He says, and there stood before the 70 elders of the ancients of the throne of the house of Israel. In the midst of them stood Jaazaniah, the son of Shaphan, with every man his censer in his hand, and a thick cloud of incense went up. So when we look at that, because they got their censer in the hand, what does that tell us about those 70 men?
We're taking an idol worship.
They're priests, right? They ain't having to buy you take their censers. But now what it seemed like to me, they were leaders of the nation. We'd understand it because these elders had assumed a priestly robe. And they probably not being that a priest, but they had assumed this robe in their religious malpractice. So what Ezekiel was seeing were heads of the tribes and families, men who had been examples of godliness, now promoting that of idolatry. The corruption were not just on the wall, it was in their hearts. So here is Jaazaniah, the son of Shaphan, probably the leader of the 70, probably identified as the son of the scribe who read the book of the law to Josiah, his brother, half-brother, Hakim. Was involved in the work of Jeremiah, and so he had decided to go a different way. And so these men were not even tempted to be priests of God. They were worshiping the unclean, detestable animals which the Egyptians, the Canaanites, and the Babylonians worshipped. Shaphan was the name of the scribe, as we said, who read Josiah, the newly founded book of God's law back in 2 Kings 22. Then he said to him, here's verse 12, then he said unto me, Son of man, hast thou seen what the ancients of the house of Israel do in the dark? Every man in the chambers of his emergy. In other words, it seems as if each one of them had a chamber. For they say, the Lord seeth us not, the Lord hath forsaken the earth. So the elders did this in the dark, that is, in the secret. Whereas these men might have said, the Lord seeth us not, chapter 9, verse 9, such is far from the truth. And so the Lord sees everything. I got something there that I don't know what I got.
I think their chamber could have possibly referred to their own home, their own dwelling.
Well, they're in a temple. They're in the temple, yeah.
True. Did he see in a vision? I think so.
He's gone through the wall.
Temple.
He's still in the temple because he went through the hole in the wall.
Oh, yeah.
And seeing rooms that they made for themselves inside the temple.
There, let me do something right quick. I got a correction right here. I can't. Okay. Then they make this statement, the Lord hath forsaken the earth, and may provide some insight into really their thinking. Okay. They no longer believe that the Lord was with them. They thought that God, Jehovah God, had deserted them. Now you stop for a moment.
The earth or the land? The land would be God's the promised land.
That's, well, again, they're in Jerusalem,
Right,
in the temple.
right.
And so they're thinking that God had deserted them. And truly he had, because of the way they'd done the temple. But do we not understand that people today do the very same thing? Why did God do this? Why wasn't God with them? Why didn't God stop this? See, so these people have just got to the very point there that they just didn't believe that God was with them. So how far do you go, in reference to them? How far had they gone? They had gone completely into idolatry.
And just in conjunction with that, back of this is these leaders refusing to acknowledge that they're the reason why this has happened to them. Like you're saying, God has left us because he doesn't care about us. No, God has left you because you aren't listening to him. Right. They refuse to acknowledge their role in this. Right.
Well, here they were the elders, they were in charge, but there was the priests. They were supposed to be teaching, but what had the 70 done? That assumed the priestly role. And therefore it shows that they're thinking in the heart. It's just like people today, they say, well, no, the Bible says that, but this is what we're going to do. We're going to do it this way, this way, this way. In other words, what's in their heart. It's not what God says. And that's what it wasn't in, they assume roles that they should not assume. Okay, verse 13, he said also unto me, we're going to stop in the verse 13. Turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abomination that they do. Even greater abomination is going to be seen. That's what he said. Okay, it's time to take a break. I got to stop the recording. Y'all remind me. I'm going to pause it.